All right, night owls and connoisseurs of uncomfortable truths, tonight we reveal a tale far less glamorous. The slow, agonizing, disgusting decline of King Henry VIII. Forget the virile portraits, we're talking a bloated, festering monarch, literally rotting alive. Absolute power couldn't buy health or decent doctors. It sucked to be Henry. If this delightfully morbid journey tickles your dark, funny bone, do the noble thing, like and subscribe. It helps unearth these dreadful tales. Where are you listening from, and what time is it? Fascinating to connect globally. Now, dim lights, and let's ease into misery. Before the infamous Tyrant, before the bloated figure haunting Hampton Court's corridors, there was another Henry, a young king, vibrant and full of life, a world away from the grotesque image that history often remembers first. To understand the tragedy of his physical decay, we must first journey back to his golden youth, to a time when Henry VIII was the epitome of kingly magnificence, the shining star of the English court. He was England's great hope, a figure seemingly blessed by fortune, admired not just for his royal blood but for the man he appeared to be. This chapter paints that dazzling, almost unbelievable portrait of a monarch who was, for a time, truly an Adonis. Picture a young man towering over most of his court, well over 6 feet tall, with a powerful, athletic build honed by constant physical exertion. His complexion was fair, his hair a striking auburn, and his features widely considered handsome, even beautiful by the standards of the day. Contemporary accounts, especially from impressed foreign envoys like the Venetian ambassadors, brim with admiration for his physique and regal bearing. He didn't just look the part of a mighty king, he exuded a natural charisma, a magnetic energy that drew people to him. This was no shy, retiring monarch, but a confident, almost dazzling presence at the heart of a glittering European Renaissance. But Henry was more than just a handsome face and a strong arm. He was a true Renaissance prince, possessing a keen intellect and a surprisingly broad education for a monarch of his time. He was fluent in Latin and French, understood some Italian, and was a passionate scholar of theology. This wasn't just for show. He penned books, most notably his Defense of the Seven Sacraments, which earned him the title Defender of the Faith from the Pope, an ironic title given his later actions. Furthermore, he was an accomplished musician and composer, with Pastime with Good Company being one of his most famous works. He cultivated an image of not just physical but also cultural and intellectual superiority. Of all his athletic pursuits, jousting held a special place in Henry's heart, and he excelled at it. This dangerous, thrilling sport was the ultimate test of knightly skill and courage, and Henry threw himself into it with characteristic gusto. Clad in magnificent, specially crafted armor, he was a formidable sight in the lists, often competing in grand tournaments that were as much about political display as they were about sport. He unhorsed many an opponent, reveling in the cheers of the crowd and the admiration of his court. His skill and daring in the joust were legendary, reinforcing his image as a chivalrous warrior king, a true successor to the mythical Arthurian heroes he so admired. Beyond the structured spectacle of the tournament, Henry's energy found another outlet in the rugged pursuit of hunting. He was an avid and tireless hunter, often spending entire days in the saddle, chasing deer and other game through the royal forests. This wasn't merely a leisurely pastime, it was a physically demanding activity that required stamina, skill with a bow or spear, and excellent horsemanship. Reports tell of him tiring out multiple horses in a single day's hunt. His passion for the chase further showcases physical vigor and endurance, connecting him to a long tradition of martial kings who proved their mettle in the wild as well as on the battlefield or in the tourney yard. The young Henry's vitality wasn't confined to overtly martial sports. He was also renowned for his love of dancing and his energetic participation in the masques and revelries that defined Tudor court life. He would dance for hours with grace and enthusiasm, a stark contrast to the lumbering figure of his later years. The court was a stage, and Henry was its leading man, dazzling observers with his athleticism, his fine clothes, and his sheer zest for life. He organized and took part in elaborate pageants and entertainments, ensuring his court was seen as one of the most vibrant and sophisticated in Europe, with himself at its energetic, captivating center. His potent combination of striking good looks, formidable athletic prowess, sharp intellect, and an engaging personality made the young Henry VIII immensely popular. When he ascended the throne in 1509 at the age of just 17, he was seen as a breath of fresh air, a charismatic and energetic monarch who embodied all the ideals of the Renaissance. England rejoiced, believing a glorious new era had dawned. He was the golden boy of European royalty, a king who seemed to possess every gift imaginable. The kingdom looked upon him with adoration and immense hope, anticipating a long and glorious reign under this seemingly perfect sovereign. His early years were truly a honeymoon period with his people. He started as a Renaissance pin-up, a figure of almost mythical perfection, the embodiment of youthful vigor and kingly grace. This dazzling image, however, was not destined to endure. The very activities that defined his vibrant youth, the feasting, the high-impact sports like jousting, which led to injuries, the immense pressure of his own expectations and those of his kingdom, perhaps sowed the subtle seeds of his later physical undoing. The incredible energy and physical confidence of his early reign make his subsequent decline all the more shocking. Little did anyone suspect this paragon of health would transform into a medical curiosity, his final years marked by pain, immobility, and decay. We've seen the vibrant, athletic Henry, epitome of Renaissance kingship. His court buzzed with energy, much from the king himself, a monarch thriving on physical exertion and the thrill of competition. Jousting, hunting, tennis, affirmations of his power, his masculinity. But even gilded images tarnish, strong physiques falter. 1536 proved a dark fulcrum in Henry's life, a point where youthful vigor began its inexorable slide towards chronic suffering thanks to a brutal jousting impact. That single, fateful moment changed everything. Jousting was the ultimate sport of kings, a dazzling display of martial skill, courage, and horsemanship. For Henry VIII, it was more than sport, it was a profound passion, an arena where he could embody the chivalric ideals he deeply admired. He had jousted since his youth, always seeking the thrill of the charge, the resounding clash of lances, the roar of the captivated crowd. But this thrilling pursuit was inherently perilous. Each thundering pass carried the grave risk of serious injury or death. Despite previous close calls and minor injuries, Henry, ever confident, perhaps reckless, continued to participate well into his 40s, his competitive spirit undimmed by age or the weighty responsibilities of his turbulent reign. The date was January 24th, 1536. The setting, Greenwich Palace's Tilt Yard. Henry, now in his mid-40s but still eager to prove his enduring mettle, prepared for another jousting day. He was clad in heavy steel armor, as was his powerful warhorse. The atmosphere was one of palpable anticipation and pageantry, a familiar Tudor court scene. But this day would deviate tragically from the script. What began as a display of royal prowess would soon become a scene of chaos and fear, etching itself into history not for its triumphs, but for its disastrous consequences for the king's health, marking the true, undeniable beginning of his physical end. During one pass, disaster struck. Accounts suggest Henry was unhorsed with considerable force. But the horror didn't end there. His heavily armored steed, also falling, crashed down on him. The sheer weight of horse and armor delivered a crushing impact. For 2 terrifying hours the king lay unconscious. Panic ripped through onlookers. The invincible monarch, the robust sportsman, was suddenly a still, unresponsive figure. Those 2 hours of silence and uncertainty were a grim foreshadowing of the long years of suffering to follow this single catastrophic fall. When Henry finally regained consciousness, the immediate damage revealed itself. He had survived but sustained a severe leg injury, specifically his thigh. Some historians suggest this accident reopened or aggravated a previous injury or an existing condition like varicose veins, making his legs more vulnerable. Whatever the initial trauma, it was clear this was no mere bruise or simple fracture. The impact was immense, the damage to tissues, bone, and vasculature of his leg profound, setting the stage for a lifetime of pain, infection, and dire complications. The immediate aftermath saw the king gravely incapacitated. For Henry, whose identity was so intertwined with his physical capabilities and commanding presence, this forced stillness was torment. The bustling, active monarch was reduced to a patient, dependent on physicians. The court, accustomed to his energetic leadership, was filled with anxiety for his future. While he eventually got back on his feet, he would never be the same. The leg injury was not one to simply heal and be forgotten. It was to become a central, agonizing feature of his remaining years on the throne. Remember the state of 16th century medical science. Germ theory was non-existent, antibiotics centuries away, surgical procedures brutal and often life-threatening. Henry's physicians, despite best intentions and traditional remedies, poultices, salves, bleeding, cauterization, were ill-equipped for such severe trauma. Their treatments, standard for the time, may have done little to prevent infection or promote true healing, and in some cases could have inadvertently exacerbated the problem, contributing to the wound's chronic painful nature. The leg injury stubbornly refused to heal. Instead of mending, it began to fester, an ominous sign. This was the critical turning point. What might have been a manageable, serious fracture or trauma in modern times became, in the 16th century, a site of persistent infection and inflammation. The wounds on his thigh developed into chronic, superurinating ulcers. These weren't superficial sores, they were deep, painful, and constantly oozing pus and foul-smelling discharge. This became a daily reality for the king, a source of unending discomfort and a grim reminder of that fateful, damaging joust. Imagine the sheer misery. A once powerful leg, symbol of his athletic youth, now a source of constant torment. It's no exaggeration to say a quick tumble from a horse and suddenly your leg decides to be a permanent, angry volcano. This vivid description captures the chronic, inflamed, eruptive nature of his leg ulcers. They would seemingly calm, only to flare up with renewed painful intensity, discharging noxious contents. This volcano became a central, unavoidable feature of his physical existence, spewing misery and impacting every aspect of his life. A constant, unwelcome companion. Ongoing attempts to treat these festering ulcers were themselves agonizing. Physicians regularly cleansed the wounds, perhaps using harsh substances. Cauterization with hot irons might have been employed to seal blood vessels or burn away diseased tissue, an excruciating procedure without anesthesia. Ulcers were likely kept open to drain, keeping the humors flowing. This meant regular, painful interventions. The king, despite his power, was subjected to the best, yet horrifically limited and painful, medical care his era could offer for such a persistent, grievous condition. This chronic, painful leg condition drastically curtailed Henry's physical activity. The man who once reveled in hours of hunting, dancing, and tennis found movement increasingly difficult and agonizing. He could no longer engage in the vigorous exercises that previously helped maintain his powerful physique. Even walking became a chore, then a visible struggle. He started to rely on assistance, eventually being carried in a chair. This enforced inactivity was a critical factor in the dramatic weight gain of his later years, creating a vicious cycle of declining health with no apparent escape. With mobility severely restricted but his appetite likely undiminished, perhaps increased by comfort eating or the rich Tudor court diet, Henry gained weight rapidly. The athletic figure of his youth became buried under layers of fat. His famous 34-inch waist reportedly expanded to a massive 54 inches or more. This obesity wasn't just appearance, it placed enormous strain on his already failing body, his heart, joints, and compromised leg. The festering wound and burgeoning weight became intertwined, mutually destructive afflictions. While this chapter focuses on physical decline, it's impossible to ignore the likely impact of chronic debilitating pain on Henry's temperament. Constant agony, frustrated physical limitations, and perhaps side effects of his condition, like fevers, would have tested a saint, let alone a monarch known for his strong will and volatile temper. Many historians correlate his increasing irascibility, paranoia, and tyrannical tendencies in his later reign with the onset of severe health problems from this 1536 accident. Pain can change a person, and Henry was in deep, unyielding pain. The 1536 jousting accident was, without doubt, the point of no return for Henry VIII's physical health. While he might have had other underlying conditions or injuries, this event triggered a cascade of ailments from which he never recovered. The open, festering wound became a gateway for recurrent infections, sapping his strength and resilience. It was the anchor dragging him down, initiating a slow, painful, visible decay that lasted for his remaining 11 years. The Golden Prince was gone, replaced by a suffering patient, his trajectory set by that one disastrous, fateful fall. The consequences of the leg injury rippled outwards, affecting his entire system. Chronic infection likely contributed to fevers and malaise. Lack of exercise exacerbated his weight gain, leading to other comorbidities, possibly type 2 diabetes, gout, and hypertension, conditions often speculated by medical historians examining his symptoms. His body became a battleground, the initial injury site the epicenter of a spreading constitutional crisis. The king, for all his divine right and earthly power, was losing a battle against his own disintegrating flesh, a sad state for such a once mighty figure. For the rest of his reign, the shadow of that unhealed leg ulcer loomed large. It dictated his movements, influenced his mood, and visibly marked his decline. It was a constant, malodorous, painful reminder of his mortality, a stark contrast to the divine authority he proclaimed. The beginning of the end wasn't subtle fading, it was a specific traumatic event, the 1536 tilt-yard crash. From that moment, Henry VIII's body's story becomes one of relentless, painful decay, a slow, miserable rot, starting with a warrior's fall, ending with a monarch consumed by his own terrible, inescapable afflictions. A grim testament. The jousting accident of 1536 left Henry VIII with more than just a scar. It gifted him a permanent, putrid companion. His chronic leg ulcers. These were not minor sores that would heal with time and care. They became an ever-present torment, a grotesque feature of his later life that defined his days and nights. This chapter delves into the horrifying reality of living with such an affliction in the 16th century, a world away from modern medicine. We explore the constant pain, the pervasive stench, the agonizing treatments, and how this festering wound became a symbol of the king's own slow, internal decay, a relentless assault. What exactly were these ulcers? Likely starting as varicose ulcers, common in heavy individuals or those with circulation issues, they were exacerbated by the trauma of his fall and subsequent infections. Given their persistence, depth, and the reported foulness, it's highly probable they were complicated by osteomyelitis, a deep infection of the bone itself. This meant the decay wasn't just superficial, it was eating into the very structure of his leg. These open, weeping wounds, possibly on both legs, but certainly one severely affected, refused to close, creating a constant battle against invading bacteria in an era that knew nothing of them. Imagine a pain that never truly leaves, not a dull ache, but a relentless, throbbing agony that gnawed at him day and night. At times, it might have sharpened into a fiery, burning sensation as the flesh inflamed, or a stabbing pain when the leg was moved or during treatments. Sleep would have been a fleeting luxury, often interrupted by fresh waves of torment. This constant suffering inevitably seeped into his temperament, fueling the irritability and rages for which his later years are infamous. Every step, every movement, even the pressure of bedclothes could have been an ordeal, a constant reminder of his body's betrayal. Beyond the raw physical sensation, the psychological burden of such unrelenting pain must have been immense. The once invincible warrior king was now engaged in a daily, losing battle with his own body. Hope for recovery would have dwindled with each passing year, replaced by a grim acceptance or perhaps a desperate, prayerful longing for relief that seldom came. This erosion of physical autonomy and the ceaseless assault on his senses would have contributed to a sense of frustration, helplessness, and perhaps even deep-seated depression, hidden beneath a veneer of bluster and royal command. The pain was an invisible cage trapping the king within his own decaying form. One of the most horrifying and inescapable aspects of Henry's condition was the smell. Chronic infected ulcers, particularly those involving necrotic tissue and potential gangrene, produce a uniquely foul and pervasive odor. It would have been a sickeningly sweet, pungent, and deeply unsettling smell of decay, the smell of rotting flesh. This stench would have clung to him, his clothes, his bedchambers, an invisible miasma that even the most powerful perfumes and incense of the Tudor court struggled to mask. It was a constant, humiliating announcement of his infirmity, a deeply personal and public affliction. Courtiers, attendants, and even his wives would have had to endure this olfactory assault. Forget cologne, his signature scent, as one might morbidly jest, was gangrenous leg with a hint of desperation. Pomanders filled with fragrant spices, rooms strewn with sweet-smelling herbs, and clothes doused in rosewater would have been employed in a constant, losing battle against the underlying putrescence. This smell was more than just unpleasant, it was a social barrier, a reminder of the corruption festering beneath the royal silks and velvets, a stark contrast to the idealized image of a divine right monarch. The agony and physical state of his ulcerated leg, or legs, severely hampered Henry's movement. Coupled with his burgeoning obesity, itself partly a consequence of his inactivity, walking became an immense, painful effort. Each step would have sent jolts of pain through his body and risked further damaging the fragile, diseased tissue. He increasingly relied on assistance, leaning on attendants, using canes, and eventually being winched or carried in chairs or on a tram, a special conveyance. This loss of independent mobility for such a previously active man was a profound humiliation and a practical nightmare for his household. This enforced immobility had cascading effects. Lack of exercise worsened his overall health, contributing to further weight gain and likely exacerbating conditions like gout and potential diabetes. His world physically shrank to the rooms he could most easily access. The great hunter and sportsman was now largely confined, his sphere of direct physical influence drastically reduced. This state of near-constant seatedness or reclined posture would also have worsened circulation in his legs, further hindering any chance of the ulcers healing, and likely promoting new sores, a truly vicious cycle of decline. The treatments for Henry's ulcers were a grim reflection of 16th century medical understanding or lack thereof. Physicians, working by the dim light of humoral theory and ancient texts, subjected the king to a relentless cycle of interventions that often caused more immediate pain with little hope of a cure. These were not gentle ministrations. The primary goal was often to cleanse the wound and promote the flow of laudable pus, which was erroneously believed to be a sign of healing. This meant the wounds were rarely allowed to rest or form a protective scab, ensuring they remained open to further infection. Regularly, physicians would have had to lance the swollen tissues around the ulcers to release the buildup of pus and fluids. Imagine the scene, the king gritting his teeth while a surgeon armed with a sharp lancet made incisions into the already inflamed and exquisitely tender flesh. This draining, while perhaps providing momentary relief from pressure, was a painful and bloody procedure, performed without anesthesia or sterile technique. Each session was an invitation for new bacteria to invade the already compromised site, perpetuating the cycle of infection and discharge, a Sisyphean task for both patient and doctor. A vast array of poultices would have been applied. Some might have contained soothing herbs like comfrey or plantain, but many contemporary recipes included far more dubious and potentially harmful ingredients. Substances like lead, mercury, or even arsenic were sometimes used in topical preparations, believed to have drying or cleansing properties. Bread and milk poultices were common, intended to draw out the evil humors, but in reality they would have created a warm, moist environment perfect for bacterial growth. The king's leg was essentially a medical testing ground for the era's desperate remedies. Perhaps the most horrific regular procedure was debridement, the cutting away of necrotic or dead flesh. Surgeons, using knives and scissors, would have meticulously, or perhaps not so meticulously, removed sloughing tissue they believed was preventing healing. This was done while the king was fully conscious, likely restrained or gripping something tightly to endure the searing pain. The idea was to expose healthy tissue beneath, but in an unhygienic environment it simply created fresh surfaces for infection. The psychological trauma of anticipating and enduring such repeated mutilations is hard to fathom. When bleeding became excessive, or if physicians believed a particularly stubborn section of the ulcer needed purification, cautery might have been employed. This involved applying red-hot metal irons directly to the wound. The stench of burning flesh would have filled the room, mingling with the existing fetor of the ulcers. The agonizing pain would have been instantaneous and extreme. While it might have sealed some blood vessels or destroyed some surface bacteria, it also caused significant tissue damage, creating more dead matter for future infection, and leaving behind horrific scars, both physical and mental. That Henry endured these treatments for over a decade speaks to both his physical constitution, at least initially, and his sheer desperation for any relief or sign of healing. He was a man of immense power, yet he was utterly powerless against this internal enemy and the brutal limitations of the medicine of his time. His physicians, themselves under enormous pressure to cure their royal patient, would have tried every remedy known to them, however painful or ultimately futile. Each failed treatment, each new flare-up, must have deepened the king's despair and frustration with his ailing body. Personal hygiene in the 16th century was not what it is today, even for a king. Bathing was infrequent for many. An open, constantly weeping and foul-smelling wound like Henry's would have presented an enormous challenge. Bandages and dressings would quickly become soiled, requiring frequent changes that were in themselves painful ordeals. Despite the efforts of his attendants, keeping the king, his linens, and his immediate environment clean and free from the pervasive odor of his illness would have been an almost impossible task. The royal bedchamber likely often resembled a charnel house more than a place of regal repose. Ultimately, Henry's chronic leg ulcer became more than just a medical condition. It was a potent physical symbol of his body's general decay and, some might argue, a dark mirror reflecting the growing fissures and turmoil within his kingdom during his later years. The once magnificent king, brought low by a festering wound that defied all his power and wealth, was a stark reminder of human frailty and mortality. This permanent putrid companion, born from a moment of knightly pride, relentlessly dragged him towards his agonizing, unroyal end, its stench a final, grim perfume of a reign in decline. The vicious cycle began with Henry VIII's festering leg ulcer, not merely a source of constant pain and putrid odor, but the insidious anchor for another profound physical transformation, his descent into extreme obesity. The once athletic king, now crippled by his unhealing wound, found his world shrinking and his ability to engage in physical activity drastically curtailed. This enforced inactivity, coupled with a royal appetite that knew no bounds, created a perfect storm for massive weight gain. His immobility fed his obesity, and his obesity in turn worsened his immobility, trapping the king in a truly vicious and ever-tightening cycle of physical decline. It's a tragic irony. The man who had prided himself on his sporting prowess, his strength, and his commanding physical presence was now becoming a prisoner in his own rapidly expanding body. The vibrant energy that had characterized his youth was extinguished, replaced by the labored movements of a man carrying an immense and unhealthy burden. His palaces, once stages for his athletic displays, slowly transformed into gilded cages as his ability to navigate them freely dwindled. This chapter explores how Henry's escalating weight became not just a personal struggle, but a significant factor in his overall health collapse and his confinement. To understand Henry's weight gain, one must comprehend the sheer scale of the Tudor royal diet. Feasts were legendary displays of power and plenty. The king's table groaned under an astonishing array of dishes, predominantly roasted and baked meats: venison, beef, pork, swan, peacock, and countless game birds. Fish was plentiful, often fried or heavily sauced. Bread was a staple, but vegetables and fruits, while available, played a far less significant role than they do in modern diets. This was a diet fit for a warrior king engaged in constant physical activity, not for an increasingly sedentary man with a crippled leg. The caloric intake was, by any standard, colossal. Thousands of calories per day were consumed, washed down with copious amounts of strong ale and wine. Sugar, once a rare luxury, was becoming more accessible and was used with abandon in both sweet and savory dishes, adding further hidden calories. While such a diet might have sustained the energetic young Henry, for the immobile, middle-aged king, it was a recipe for disaster. His body, unable to burn the vast quantities of fuel he consumed, simply stored it as fat, layer upon layer, relentlessly adding to his bulk. There was little understanding in the 16th century of calorie counting or the long-term health impacts of such a rich, meat-heavy diet, especially when coupled with inactivity. For Henry, eating like a king was a royal prerogative, perhaps even a psychological comfort, as other physical pleasures waned. But every lavish meal, every goblet of wine, added to the immense strain on his already struggling frame. His legendary appetite, once a sign of his vitality and largesse, became a key contributor to his painful and undignified physical unraveling, a slow-motion act of self-destruction through royal indulgence. As the pounds piled on, Henry's ability to move independently diminished dramatically. The man who once danced for hours and hunted tirelessly was now a figure of immense, almost static bulk. It's cruelly accurate to say he ate like a king, moved like a very large, disgruntled potato. His days were increasingly spent seated, his world viewed from a chair or his bed. The effort of merely standing or taking a few steps would have become a monumental, breathless task, further discouraging any attempt at physical exertion. This lethargy, born of pain and compounded by sheer mass, solidified his confinement. Contemporary accounts and the ever-increasing size of his surviving suits of armor paint a vivid picture of his physical expansion. His waistline, a trim 32 to 34 inches in his youth, ballooned to an astonishing 54 inches, and some estimates suggest it may have reached 60 inches towards the end. His chest measurements similarly swelled. He became a figure of enormous girth, his features coarsening, his once athletic frame lost beneath a mountain of flesh. This wasn't just stoutness, it was morbid obesity, a condition that would have shocked and strained the limits of 16th century tailoring and engineering. Living as a man of such enormous size in the 16th century posed immense practical challenges. Clothes had to be specially made, constantly enlarged. Armor, when he could still bear its weight for ceremonial occasions, became a feat of engineering. Navigating staircases was an ordeal, if not impossible. Special chairs, wider and stronger, were required. It's reported that mechanical devices, or engines, were sometimes used to hoist or move the king, a humiliating necessity for a monarch who once epitomized physical power and independence. His bulk dictated the logistics of his daily life. His colossal weight placed an unbearable strain on his already ravaged legs. The chronic ulcers, struggling to heal in the best of circumstances, were now burdened with supporting an ever-increasing mass. This pressure would have impaired circulation further, likely worsening the varicose condition and the ulcers themselves, and increasing the risk of new sores developing. Each step, if he could take it, would have been agonizing not just from the ulcers, but from joints screaming under the load. His legs became failing pillars beneath an overwhelming edifice of flesh. Morbid obesity is not a passive condition. It actively attacks the body, and Henry's case was no exception. The excess weight triggered a cascade of debilitating health problems. His heart, forced to pump blood through an increasingly vast network of vessels and to move an enormous body, would have been under enormous strain. Hypertension or high blood pressure was an almost certain consequence, even if undiagnosable at the time. The risk of sudden cardiac events, stroke, or congestive heart failure would have loomed large, silent threats accompanying his every labored breath. Breathing itself likely became a struggle. The sheer weight of fat on his chest and abdomen would have restricted his lung capacity, leading to shortness of breath, especially on exertion or even at rest. Sleep apnea, where breathing repeatedly stops and starts during sleep, is a common companion of severe obesity and would have further disrupted his already pain-filled nights, leaving him chronically fatigued. The king, who once commanded armies with a booming voice, may have found himself gasping for air after minimal effort, his pronouncements wheezed rather than proclaimed. While anachronistic to definitively diagnose, Henry exhibited many symptoms consistent with what we now call type 2 diabetes. His obesity was a prime risk factor. The unhealing nature of his leg ulcers, his reported excessive thirst at times, and his general systemic illness all align with the complications of uncontrolled blood sugar. This sugar sickness, as it might have been vaguely conceptualized, would have further poisoned his system, impaired healing, and increased his susceptibility to infections, making his ulcers even more intractable and his overall condition more perilous. Henry is famously known to have suffered from gout, an excruciatingly painful form of inflammatory arthritis. His rich, meat-heavy diet and copious alcohol consumption were classic triggers for this condition, which causes sharp uric acid crystals to deposit in the joints, often the big toe, but also knees, ankles, and wrists. Obesity is a major risk factor for gout and worsens its attacks. Imagine the existing agony of his ulcerated legs compounded by sudden, searing gout was another layer of misery directly linked to his lifestyle and his immense weight. Beyond the specific ailments, Henry's sheer size and resulting ill health matter increasingly hampered his ability to function as an active ruler. Personal inspections of fortifications, leading troops even ceremonially, or even enduring long council meetings, would have become physically taxing if not impossible. His reliance on others for basic mobility eroded his image of vigorous kingship. While his mind remained sharp, though perhaps colored by pain and paranoia, his physical capacity to impose his will directly upon his environment was severely diminished. He ruled from his chair, a monarch increasingly isolated by his own failing body. As his immobility and size increased, the grand palaces of Whitehall, Hampton Court, and Greenwich transformed from symbols of his power into elaborate prisons. He was confined to his chambers or specific accessible routes within them, his world shrinking daily. The man who had roamed vast hunting grounds was now trapped by his own physical state. This confinement, for a personality as dominant and restless as Henry's, must have been a source of profound psychological distress, fueling his frustrations and perhaps contributing to the tyrannical outbursts that marked his later reign. His body became his jail. Ultimately, Henry's extreme obesity was a crushing burden, both literally and figuratively. It suffocated his vitality, crippled his mobility, and unleashed a host of life-threatening diseases upon his already weakened frame. It was the grim partner to his chronic leg ulcers, each exacerbating the other in a deadly synergy. The once golden prince, the epitome of Renaissance vigor, was reduced to a bloated, immobile, and pain-racked figure, a stark testament to how even the most powerful monarch cannot escape the consequences of a body overwhelmed. His weight was the final heavy seal on his agonizing decline. As if the unceasing agony of his festering leg ulcers and the crushing burden of his extreme obesity weren't enough, King Henry VIII's failing body conjured yet another torment in his later years: grossly swollen legs. This was no ordinary puffiness, it was a severe and persistent fluid retention, a condition known in his time as dropsy. This watery affliction added a new layer of misery to his already profound suffering, further restricting his movement and serving as a visible, deeply unsettling sign of his body's systemic collapse. His royal legs, once symbols of his athletic prowess, were now bloated, heavy, and failing. Dropsy, or edema as we call it today, is the abnormal accumulation of fluid in the body's tissues, typically in the cavities or beneath the skin. For Henry, this primarily manifested in his lower extremities, transforming his legs and feet into distended, waterlogged appendages. It was as if his body was slowly drowning from within, its natural ability to regulate fluids completely overwhelmed. This watery woe was not an isolated issue, but a consequence of the multiple organ systems failing under the immense strain of his numerous ailments, a grim testament to his deteriorating health. In the 16th century, the precise physiological causes of dropsy were poorly understood. It was generally attributed to an imbalance of the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, or seen as a weakness of certain organs, unable to process fluids correctly. Physicians recognized it as a grave symptom, often heralding the final stages of an illness. While they could observe the dramatic swelling, their explanations were couched in ancient theories that offered little insight into the true mechanics of heart failure, kidney dysfunction, or circulatory collapse that we now know underlie such conditions. A primary culprit behind Henry's dropsy was almost certainly congestive heart failure. Decades of morbid obesity, a relentlessly rich diet, and likely untreated hypertension had placed an intolerable burden on his royal heart. Gradually, this vital organ would have weakened, losing its ability to pump blood effectively throughout his massive frame. As the heart struggled, blood would have backed up in the venous system, particularly in the lower body, forcing fluid out of the capillaries and into the surrounding tissues of his legs and feet, leading to profound, persistent swelling. Compounding the effects of a failing heart was severe venous insufficiency in his legs. His chronic ulcers, the years of immobility, and the sheer pressure of his excess weight would have damaged the veins and their delicate valves, which are essential for returning blood from the legs to the heart. With these valves compromised, blood would pool in his lower limbs, increasing pressure within the veins and exacerbating fluid leakage into the tissues. His legs, already a source of chronic infection and pain, became stagnant, swollen pools, unable to effectively clear waste fluids. Henry's suspected type 2 diabetes could also have played a significant role in the development of his edema. Uncontrolled diabetes can damage blood vessels throughout the body, including those in the kidneys, impairing their ability to filter waste and regulate fluid balance. Furthermore, diabetes can affect nerve function, neuropathy, which might reduce sensation and impair circulation in the extremities, making them more susceptible to swelling and injury. The sugar sickness was thus another insidious contributor to the waterlogging of the king's lower limbs, adding to his complex medical nightmare. While historical records don't provide a clear diagnosis of kidney disease, it's a highly plausible factor. The same conditions stressing his heart, obesity, hypertension, and potential diabetes, are also major risk factors for chronic kidney disease. Failing kidneys lose their ability to excrete excess sodium and water, leading directly to fluid retention and generalized edema. The king's body was fighting a losing battle on multiple fronts, and his kidneys, crucial for maintaining fluid equilibrium, were likely casualties in this systemic breakdown, further contributing to his dropsical state. His legs weren't just swollen, they were staging a silent, watery protest against years of abuse and systemic failure. Imagine them, distended to perhaps twice their normal size, the skin stretched taut and shiny like an overfilled wineskin. Pressing a finger into the flesh would have left a deep indentation, pitting edema, a telltale sign of the excess fluid trapped beneath. The natural contours of ankle and calf would have been lost, submerged beneath this relentless fluid overload. They were a grotesque parody of healthy limbs, heavy, unresponsive, and visibly waterlogged. The sensation in these swollen limbs would have been one of profound discomfort and heaviness. His legs would have felt tight, as if the skin might burst, a constant, dull ache, quite different from the sharp pain of gout or the burning of his ulcers, would have permeated them. They would have felt cold and unresponsive at times due to poor circulation, yet also inflamed and tender. The sheer weight of the trapped fluid would have made lifting his legs an immense effort, transforming them into leaden anchors, chaining him to his chair or bed. The skin over his edematous legs would have been incredibly fragile and vulnerable. Stretched to its limit by the underlying fluid, it would have been prone to weeping clear or yellowish fluid, lymphorrhea, breaking down or developing secondary infections, especially around his existing ulcers. This would have created new sites of pain and potential entry points for bacteria, further complicating his already dire dermatological situation. His lower body was becoming a landscape of weeping sores, tight shiny skin, and grotesque swelling, a truly miserable condition. If movement was already a struggle due to his ulcers and obesity, the dropsy made it nearly impossible. His legs, now enormously heavy and unwieldy, would have been incredibly difficult to maneuver. The simple act of standing would have required immense effort and likely caused significant pain and dizziness as fluid shifted. Getting in and out of bed or his chair would have necessitated even more assistance from his beleaguered attendants. His confinement became more absolute, his dependence on others for every basic need more profound, a severe blow to his regal pride. Physicians in the 16th century had a range of treatments for dropsy, though most were ineffective and some actively harmful. Herbal diuretics, derived from plants like broom, parsley, or the potent and dangerous foxglove, were administered in an attempt to increase urine output and rid the body of excess fluid. The dosage of such remedies was imprecise, and side effects could be severe. These offered little solace against the tide of fluid accumulating in the king's limbs, often causing more distress than relief through their purgative actions. More drastic measures included bloodletting and aggressive purging with laxatives and emetics. The theory was that removing excess humors or fluids directly from the body would alleviate the swelling. However, these debilitating practices would have further weakened the already ailing king, depleting him of essential fluids and electrolytes without addressing the underlying causes like heart or kidney failure. Such interventions were born of desperation and a flawed medical framework, often leaving the patient in a worse state than before, hastening their decline rather than aiding recovery. Occasionally, physicians might have tried binding the legs or elevating them, which could offer minor temporary relief, but these measures were palliative at best against such severe systemic edema. No Tudor physician could truly comprehend, let alone reverse, the complex organ failures causing Henry's dropsy. The king, surrounded by the best medical minds of his time, was nonetheless a helpless victim of his body's irreversible decay and the profound limitations of contemporary medical knowledge. Each failed remedy underscored the grim prognosis his swollen limbs represented. The sight of the king's massively swollen legs would have been deeply alarming to his court. Dropsy was widely recognized as a sign of profound internal imbalance and often a precursor to death. It was a visible manifestation that the body's essential functions were breaking down. The once mighty monarch, now waterlogged and immobile, was a living symbol of decay. This physical evidence of his failing health would have fueled anxieties about the succession and the stability of the kingdom, casting a pall over his final years, a constant memento mori for all to see. Henry's dropsy was a cruel final insult from his failing body. It represented a state where his system was so overwhelmed it could no longer manage its own internal environment. The heavy, fluid-filled legs were a constant, uncomfortable burden, a physical manifestation of his organs giving up. This silent, watery protest was a clear signal that the king was drowning, not in the waters of the English Channel, but in the retained fluids of his own systemic collapse. It was a slow, uncomfortable, and undignified descent, adding another layer of misery to his already tragic and rotten end. King Henry VIII's litany of physical torments extended beyond his festering ulcers, burdensome obesity, and swollen, dropsical legs. Lurking within, an often invisible yet profoundly debilitating ailment frequently gripped him, severe chronic headaches. While his more visible afflictions shocked the court and have fascinated historians, these intense episodes of head pain added another cruel layer to his daily suffering. This was not the fleeting discomfort of a common headache, this was a persistent, agonizing affliction. A veritable crown of pain for the beleaguered king, further complicating his already miserable existence. Unlike his oozing sores or his massive girth, headaches were an internal enemy, an unseen tormentor that could strike with little warning. For a man of Henry's immense power and authority, to be brought low by such an intangible yet overwhelming pain must have been deeply frustrating. This chapter delves into the likely nature of these headaches, their probable causes rooted in his deteriorating health and stressful life, the primitive attempts to treat them, and how this invisible suffering contributed to the overall picture of a monarch quite literally rotting alive, both inside and out, under a crushing weight of ailments. Imagine a pain that hammers relentlessly from within the skull. It might have been a throbbing, pounding sensation synchronized with his struggling heartbeat, or a constricting, vice-like pressure that made even thinking an ordeal. Perhaps it was a sharp, piercing pain localized behind his eyes, or a diffuse agony that consumed his entire head. If these were migraines, they could have been accompanied by visual disturbances, nausea, and an acute sensitivity to light and sound, transforming his royal chambers into potential torture rooms. The exact nature is lost to time, but the severity is implied by its chronic nature. Indeed, even a king couldn't escape a headache that felt like a tiny army marching through his skull, each footfall a spike of pain, each drumbeat a throb of misery. This vivid metaphor captures the invasive, relentless, and overwhelming nature of severe head pain. It speaks to a torment that commandeers one's senses, making concentration impossible and ordinary existence a trial. For Henry, whose mind was his greatest remaining asset in ruling his kingdom, such internal assaults would have been particularly debilitating, a cruel mockery of his sovereign power. As one of the most probable culprits behind Henry's severe headaches was extreme hypertension. His morbid obesity, rich diet laden with salt and fats, and constant stress created a perfect storm for dangerously high blood pressure. Sustained hypertension can lead to intense, pounding headaches, often worse in the mornings as the pressure within the cranial blood vessels becomes excessive. This relentless internal pressure would have felt like his head was about to explode, a direct physiological consequence of his unhealthy lifestyle and failing cardiovascular system, a throbbing reminder of his body's rebellion. The sheer psychological stress of Henry's reign cannot be underestimated as a contributor to his head pain. He navigated treacherous political landscapes, orchestrated a tumultuous religious reformation, waged wars, and endured a chaotic marital history, all while desperately seeking a male heir. Such immense and prolonged stress is a well-known trigger for tension headaches and can exacerbate migraines. The weight of his responsibilities, the constant fear of plots, and his personal anxieties would have tightened their grip on his mind, manifesting as physical pain that no royal decree could banish. We must also consider the long-term consequences of Henry's jousting accidents, particularly the severe fall in 1536 where he lay unconscious for 2 hours. Such a significant head trauma could easily have resulted in post-concussion syndrome, a condition often characterized by chronic headaches, dizziness, and difficulty concentrating, lasting for months or even years. Earlier falls or blows to the head during his martial pursuits might also have contributed to a cumulative effect, leaving his brain more susceptible to persistent pain. The ghosts of past jousts may have quite literally haunted his head. Henry's myriad other health issues likely played a part too. The recurrent fevers and systemic inflammation from his chronic leg infections could certainly have induced severe headaches. If his kidneys were indeed failing, as suspected with his dropsy, the buildup of toxins in his bloodstream, uremia, can cause persistent and debilitating head pain. Simultaneously, metabolic imbalances from his potential diabetes or even side effects from the primitive concoctions he was given as medicine could have added to this symphony of cranial discomfort. His head was a battleground for his body's many failings. While the understanding of dietary headache triggers was virtually non-existent in the 16th century, it's plausible that Henry's notoriously excessive diet played a role. Certain foods and drink, aged cheeses, preserved meats, and copious amounts of wine and ale, all staples of his table, are now known to be potential migraine triggers in susceptible individuals. The sheer irregularity and richness of his consumption, coupled with possible dehydration despite his liquid intake, might have created a biochemical environment ripe for inducing or worsening his already painful headaches. Chronic, severe head pain would have undoubtedly affected Henry's ability to govern. When gripped by such an episode, his concentration would have shattered, his patience worn thin, and his decision-making capacity clouded. Important matters of state might have been postponed, or worse, addressed by a monarch whose judgment was compromised by intense suffering. His infamous irascibility and tyrannical outbursts in later years could well have been exacerbated by these relentless, invisible attacks, making him an even more unpredictable and formidable figure to his council and court. If Henry suffered from true migraines, the accompanying symptoms would have been dreadful. Nausea and even vomiting could have further weakened him. An acute sensitivity to light, photophobia, and sound, phoneophobia, would have made the bustling, brightly lit, and often noisy environment of the Tudor court unbearable during an attack. He might have frequently retreated to darkened, quiet bedchambers, seeking any respite from the sensory onslaught that intensified his cranial torment. This withdrawal would have further isolated him, cutting him off from the daily life of his own palace. The 16th century offered a bizarre and largely ineffective pharmacopoeia for headaches. Herbal remedies were paramount. Betony, a plant highly esteemed since classical times for head complaints, might have been prescribed as a drink or applied as a plaster. Lavender, rosemary, chamomile, and vervain were also commonly used, their aromas perhaps offering some slight soothing effect but little real relief from severe pain. These were gentle attempts against a ferocious internal enemy, often failing to make a dent in his agony. When herbal remedies failed, more drastic and invasive treatments might have been considered or employed. Bloodletting from the temples, forehead, or neck was a common practice for almost any ailment believed to involve fullness or bad humors, causing pressure. Binding the head tightly with cloths was another simple, if often futile, attempt to constrict the pain. Some treatments involved making small incisions in the scalp or applying counter-irritants, hoping to draw out the pain. Each would have added to his discomfort with little guarantee of success. While direct evidence is lacking for Henry, the most extreme historical cure for severe head conditions was trepanning, drilling or scraping a hole into the skull to relieve pressure or release supposed evil spirits. This was an incredibly dangerous procedure, rarely undertaken and often fatal. While it's unlikely Henry underwent this, the very existence of such a desperate remedy highlights the terror severe head pain could induce and the extreme lengths to which people might consider going for relief. For Henry, however, such a risk was probably deemed too great, leaving him to suffer. Unlike his visibly rotting leg or his dramatically expanding waistline, Henry's headaches were an invisible affliction. There were no external signs for courtiers to gasp at, only the king's own testimony of suffering, his irritability, or his withdrawal. This invisibility might have made the torment harder for others to fully comprehend or sympathize with, yet for Henry, the pain was intensely real, a deeply personal battle fought within the confines of his own skull. It was a hidden cross he bore, adding to the weight of his more public infirmities, an unseen crack in his royal facade. Ultimately, Henry's chronic headaches and migraines were another voice in the chorus of his body's agonizing decay. Whether caused by hypertension, stress, old injuries, or the general toxemia of his failing organs, they represented a fundamental breakdown of his physical well-being. This crown of pain, was a relentless reminder of his mortality and his inability, despite his absolute power, to command his own body. The tiny army marching through his skull was but one of many legions laying siege to the once mighty king, ensuring his final years were not just a physical rot, but a relentless throbbing misery. Adding to King Henry VIII's catalogue of corporeal miseries was an affliction historically known as the disease of kings, gout. This excruciating form of inflammatory arthritis became a frequent and unwelcome guest in the king's later years, bringing with it waves of immobilizing pain. While his leg ulcers festered and his girth expanded, gout launched its own agonizing assaults on his joints, ensuring that any moment of respite from his other torments was likely to be short-lived. For Henry, it was yet another brutal reminder of his body's profound and multifaceted decay, a truly royal agony. Gout is not merely a general ache, it's a specific and vicious condition caused by the buildup of uric acid in the blood. When these levels become too high, the uric acid can crystallize, forming microscopic, needle-like shards of monosodium urate. These crystals then deposit in the joints and surrounding tissues, triggering an intense inflammatory response from the body. The result is a sudden, savage attack of pain, redness, heat, and swelling in the affected joint, a true internal siege by crystalline invaders, turning parts of the king's own body against him. While gout can affect various joints, its most notorious and classic target is the metatarsal phalangeal joint at the base of the big toe, a condition specifically termed podagra. For many sufferers, including very likely Henry VIII, this was the primary site of their torment. This seemingly small joint, when inflamed by gout, could produce pain so disproportionately severe that it could incapacitate a grown man, even a powerful king. The big toe, an unassuming part of the anatomy, could thus hold the entire monarch hostage to its fiery, crystalline rage, dictating his ability to stand, walk, or even bear the slightest touch. Indeed, during a flare-up, it must have seemed as though His Majesty's big toe declared war on his entire body, and it was winning. This single, small joint, inflamed and throbbing, could radiate such intense pain that it overshadowed all other discomforts, demanding singular, agonizing attention. The image of a tiny digit bringing a mighty king to his knees, or confining him to his bed, underscores the sheer ferocity of a gout attack and the helplessness even a monarch felt in its grip. The royal foot became a battlefield, and Henry was its primary casualty. The primary fuel for Henry's gout was undoubtedly his famously indulgent diet. He consumed vast quantities of red meat, game, organ meats like liver and kidney, and certain types of seafood, all foods rich in purines, which break down into uric acid in the body. His prodigious intake of alcohol, particularly strong ales and wines, further exacerbated the problem, as alcohol can both increase uric acid production and reduce its excretion by the kidneys. His royal table, laden with delicacies, was effectively a purine-laden minefield, constantly priming his system for the next agonizing attack. Henry's severe obesity was another significant contributing factor to his gout. Excess body weight increases uric acid production and reduces its renal excretion, creating a perfect storm for hyperuricemia. The sheer mass the king carried put additional stress on his weight-bearing joints, potentially making them more susceptible to urate crystal deposition and inflammation. His expanding girth was not just a burden on his heart and mobility, it was actively feeding the flames of his gout, tightening the painful embrace of this debilitating condition and ensuring more frequent, severe attacks. While lifestyle factors like diet and obesity are major players in gout, a genetic predisposition often lurks in the background. It's quite possible that Henry inherited a tendency towards less efficient uric acid excretion or higher production, making him inherently more vulnerable to developing the condition, regardless of his royal excesses. If this were the case, his indulgent lifestyle would have acted as a powerful catalyst, turning a latent susceptibility into a full-blown, chronic, and agonizing disease. His lineage might have dealt him a hidden card that his feasting tragically played. The health of Henry's kidneys, already under suspicion due to his dropsy and potential diabetes, would also have been critical in his battle with gout. Kidneys are responsible for filtering uric acid out of the blood and excreting it in urine. If his kidney function was impaired by his other conditions or by the general systemic strain, their ability to clear uric acid effectively would have been compromised. This would lead to higher, more persistent levels of uric acid in his bloodstream, making crystal formation and gout attacks almost inevitable, a sign of another failing system. A gout attack typically begins with terrifying suddenness, often waking the sufferer from sleep in the early hours of the morning. The pain rapidly escalates from a mere twinge to an excruciating, unbearable agony within hours. It's often described as a burning, crushing, or throbbing sensation, as if the joint is being torn apart from the inside or held in a fiery vice, For Henry, these sudden descents into extreme pain would have been horrifying, interrupting any semblance of normal life and plunging him into a world of pure, unadulterated suffering, making his nights as feared as his days. The affected joint, very often Henry's big toe or perhaps a knee or ankle, would become visibly inflamed, red, hot to the touch, and exquisitely swollen. The skin over the joint might appear shiny and purplish. The tenderness was legendary. Even the slight pressure of a bedsheet, a gentle breeze, or the vibration of someone walking across the room could send shockwaves of unbearable pain through the afflicted limb. This made any attempt to move, let alone walk, an exercise in pure torture, effectively immobilizing the king during acute episodes. For a king who once strode confidently through his palaces, gout rendered walking a torturous ordeal. During an attack, putting any weight on the affected foot would have been unthinkable. Even between flare-ups, chronic gout could lead to joint damage and persistent soreness, making every step a painful reminder of the disease. This, combined with his leg ulcers, obesity, and dropsy, meant Henry's mobility was progressively destroyed. His world became smaller, his reliance on chairs, carriers, and attendants absolute, a profound indignity for the once athletic monarch. The simple act of dressing would have become a painful challenge during gout attacks. Pulling on stockings or wearing shoes over a swollen, inflamed foot or ankle would have been excruciating. It's likely that special, softer footwear, or even just loose bandages, were all he could tolerate on his afflicted limbs. Even the weight of his heavy royal robes might have felt oppressive. The grandeur of his attire would have stood in stark contrast to the agonizing reality of the tender, inflamed joints hidden beneath, a constant source of private misery. 16th century physicians had various approaches to treating gout, with varying degrees of efficacy and risk. One of the most specific and ancient remedies was derived from the autumn crocus or meadow saffron, Colchicum autumnale. Colchicine, its active ingredient, can be effective in reducing gout inflammation, but it's also highly toxic, and the line between a therapeutic dose and a poisonous one was dangerously thin. If Henry's doctors prescribed it, it would have been a gamble, potentially offering relief at the cost of severe gastrointestinal side effects or worse. Physicians often advised dietary moderation, reducing meat and wine, but for a king like Henry, accustomed to lavish indulgence, such advice was likely hard to follow consistently. Herbal remedies beyond colchicum, such as willow bark, a natural salicylate, might have been used for pain relief. Poultices, perhaps made with soothing herbs or less pleasant concoctions, would have been applied externally to the inflamed joint. Rest and elevation of the limb were sensible measures often recommended, offering some comfort during the throes of an attack. Each gout attack was more than just a temporary period of intense pain. It contributed to Henry's overall decline and his notoriously foul temper. The debilitating pain, coupled with sleep deprivation and frustration at his immobility, would have frayed his nerves and shortened his fuse, making him even more difficult and tyrannical. Gout added another layer of chronic suffering to his already burdened existence, ensuring that his final years were characterized by near-constant physical torment from a multitude of sources, a symphony of ailments playing out in his decaying body. In the end, Henry's gout was a relentless foe, a painful testament to a lifetime of royal excess and a body breaking down under multiple pressures. The disease of kings claimed him as one of its most prominent victims, its agonizing flare-ups a regular feature of his miserable decline. While his leg ulcers rotted him from the outside and his obesity crushed him from within, gout attacked his very joints with fiery, crystalline precision. The image of his great toe holding sway over the mighty king serves as a potent symbol of how, despite all his power, Henry was ultimately vanquished by the rebellion of his own flesh. King Henry VIII's descent into a state of rotting decay was tragically hastened not just by his numerous ailments, but by the very cures administered by his esteemed royal physicians. In the 16th century, medicine was a world away from the evidence-based science we know today. It was a realm dominated by ancient theories, empirical guesswork, and treatments that, while well-intentioned, often inflicted further suffering or actively harmed the patient. For Henry, this meant his immense wealth and power could not shield him from the often brutal and ineffective medical practices of his era, a truly terrifying prospect for any sick individual. This chapter pulls back the curtain on the rudimentary and frequently dangerous world of Tudor medicine that Henry VIII was subjected to. We'll explore the prevailing theories that guided his doctors, the alarming treatments they prescribed, and how these interventions likely exacerbated his conditions rather than alleviating them. From bloodletting to bizarre concoctions, the medical care available to the king was a minefield of bad ideas, a stark illustration of how even the most powerful man on earth was utterly at the mercy of the profound medical ignorance of his time, making his suffering all the more profound. At the heart of 16th century medical thought lay the ancient Greek theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, choler, and black bile, melancholy. It was believed that a healthy body maintained a perfect balance of these four fluids, each associated with specific qualities: hot, cold, moist, dry, and temperaments. Illness, therefore, was not seen as a result of specific pathogens or organ dysfunction as we understand it, but as a disruptive imbalance of these vital humors. Every diagnosis and treatment plan was filtered through this fundamentally flawed, yet universally accepted lens. A patient like Henry, suffering from multiple ailments, would have been assessed for which humor was in excess or deficient. For example, his fiery gout attacks might be attributed to an excess of hot, dry choler or perhaps corrupt blood. Fevers were often seen as an excess of heat. The physician's primary goal was to restore humoral equilibrium, typically by attempting to remove the presumed excess humor or by administering substances believed to counteract its dominant qualities, for instance, cooling remedies for hot diseases or moistening agents for dry conditions. This simplistic approach dictated the often aggressive interventions. Perhaps no medical practice was more ubiquitous or emblematic of this era than bloodletting. Believed to rid the body of bad or excess blood or to divert humors from an afflicted area, it was applied for an astonishing array of conditions, from fevers and inflammations to headaches and even emotional distress. Henry VIII would undoubtedly have been subjected to frequent phlebotomy. His physicians, armed with lancets, would have opened veins in his arms or temples, draining precious blood in the misguided belief they were cleansing his system or reducing harmful excesses. Beyond direct venesection with a lancet, other methods of bloodletting included cupping and the application of leeches. Cupping involved placing heated glass cups on the skin to create suction, sometimes after making small incisions to draw blood to the surface or out of the body. Leeches, eagerly applied to afflicted areas, would gorge themselves on the patient's blood, a living tool for humoral rebalancing. For Henry's inflamed, gouty joints, or perhaps even his ulcerated legs, these blood-drawing techniques would have been standard, yet debilitating treatments, further weakening his already struggling constitution. If bloodletting targeted one set of humors, purging aimed to expel others through different exits. Potent emetics were administered to induce violent vomiting, while harsh laxatives and clysters were employed to cleanse the bowels. The idea was to forcibly eject any corrupt or excessive humors like phlegm or bile that were thought to be causing disease. For a king like Henry, suffering from digestive issues related to his diet and obesity, or simply as a general cleansing measure, these treatments would have been exhausting, dehydrating, and offered no real therapeutic benefit for his underlying chronic conditions. The king's physicians and apothecaries would have prescribed a bewildering array of medicinal concoctions. Tudor pharmacy was a complex art, relying heavily on herbal remedies, but also incorporating animal products and minerals in often bizarre combinations. Ingredients could range from the relatively benign, like rosewater or chamomile, to the outright dangerous, such as mercury, arsenic, or lead, used in minute, but still toxic, quantities. Preparations often involve dozens of ingredients, a shotgun approach, hoping something might work, with little understanding of pharmacology. A prime example of polypharmacy was theriac, or Venice treacle, a legendary and highly expensive antidote believed to cure almost anything, from poisons to plagues. Its recipe, jealously guarded, could contain over 60 ingredients, including viper's flesh, opium, cinnamon, myrrh, and numerous other exotic herbs and substances. Henry, with his access to the best, would certainly have been given such complex and costly remedies. While opium might have offered some pain relief, the overall efficacy of theriac for his chronic conditions was negligible, its mystique far outweighing its actual medical value. The inclusion of heavy metals like mercury and antimony in some medicinal preparations was particularly perilous. Mercury, for example, was sometimes used to treat skin conditions or syphilis, which some speculate Henry had, though evidence is debated. These substances are potent neurotoxins and can cause severe cumulative damage to the kidneys and nervous system. If Henry ingested or had such compounds applied to his ulcers, they could have contributed to his overall systemic poisoning, insidiously worsening his health under the guise of treatment, a truly hidden danger. Major surgical interventions in the 16th century were terrifying prospects, usually undertaken only in dire emergencies. They were the domain of barber surgeons, who possessed practical skills but often lacked the theoretical education of physicians. Procedures like amputations, setting complex fractures, or treating deep wounds like Henry's jousting injuries or lancing his ulcers were performed without effective anesthesia beyond alcohol or opiates, which were difficult to dose and carried their own risks. The patient faced the ordeal fully conscious of the excruciating pain. A common surgical tool for managing wounds and staunching bleeding was cauterization, the application of red-hot irons to the flesh. This would have been used on Henry's battle injuries and quite possibly in the treatment of his leg ulcers to burn away proud flesh or seal blood vessels. The immediate pain was unimaginable, and the risk of subsequent infection in an era without antibiotics was enormous. Surgical interventions, even minor ones like lancing an abscess, often led to sepsis and death. For Henry, every cleansing of his ulcers was a brush with surgical brutality. It's no exaggeration to state that for many ailments in Henry's time, their cures were often more terrifying than the diseases themselves. Imagine the dread of anticipating the physician's visit, knowing it might involve being bled to faintness, forced to vomit uncontrollably, or having a festering wound agonizingly scraped and burned. The psychological trauma of these repeated, painful, and ultimately futile interventions must have been immense, adding mental anguish to Henry's already overwhelming physical suffering. Trust in his doctors was a leap of faith into a painful unknown. With the benefit of hindsight, it's clear that many of the treatments Henry endured likely worsened his condition, a phenomenon known as iatrogenic harm, illness caused by medical examination or treatment. Bloodletting would have induced anemia and weakness, hampering his body's ability to fight infection. Purging would have led to dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. Toxic ingredients in medicines could have poisoned him slowly. The constant interference with his ulcers, while intended to help, likely introduced new infections and prevented any natural healing process. Henry VIII employed some of the most renowned physicians in England, men like William Butts. They were learned, dedicated, and undoubtedly did their best according to the medical paradigms of their day. The king paid them handsomely and had access to the most expensive ingredients and treatments available, yet all this wealth and status could not buy him effective relief or a cure because the fundamental understanding of disease and the human body was so deeply flawed. His royal status simply guaranteed him more intensive exposure to these misguided practices. Ultimately, Henry VIII was a prisoner of the medical understanding of his age. The leeches, the lancets, the purging drafts, and the bizarre concoctions were all products of a pre-scientific worldview where tradition and ancient authority trumped observation and empirical evidence. While his lifestyle undoubtedly laid the groundwork for his many illnesses, the medieval medicine he received did little to halt his agonizing decline, and in all probability actively contributed to his suffering and the slow, putrid decay that consumed him. He rotted alive, not just from disease, but from care. The tyrant's transformation began as King Henry VIII's physical decay rippled far beyond his rotting flesh and swollen limbs. The relentless assault of pain, disease, and injury appears to have profoundly warped his mind and temperament, contributing to the monstrous tyranny that stains his later reign. The once charismatic golden prince devolved into a suspicious, cruel, and unpredictable despot. This chapter explores the chilling possibility that Henry's infamous cruelty was not just innate wickedness, but a personality twisted and poisoned by years of unrelenting physical suffering and potential brain trauma. It's a question that has haunted historians for centuries. Was he just a bad guy, or was his body slowly poisoning his personality? While we cannot excuse his brutal actions, the executions, the betrayals, the reigns of terror, understanding the immense physical and psychological pressures he endured offers a crucial if disturbing context. We could delve into how chronic pain, debilitating illnesses, and possible brain injuries may have fueled the paranoia, irascibility, and impulsiveness that defined the terrifying latter half of his rule, transforming a king into a feared tyrant. The contrast between the young Henry and the aging monarch is stark. In his youth, he was lauded for his charm, intellect, athleticism, and seemingly affable nature. He was the embodiment of Renaissance kingship, admired across Europe. Yet, the Henry of the 1540s was a different creature entirely. Bloated, immobile, suspicious, quick to anger, and terrifyingly ruthless. This dramatic shift wasn't just the cynicism of age. It coincided too closely with the catastrophic decline of his physical health to be mere coincidence, suggesting a deeper, illness-driven corrosion. Imagine living with constant, severe pain for years, as Henry did from his leg ulcers, gout, headaches, and dropsy. Chronic pain is a known psychological tormentor. It frays nerves, shatters sleep, impairs concentration, and can lead to persistent irritability, anxiety, and even depression. For Henry, whose days were filled with such agony, it's highly probable that his threshold for frustration plummeted. His empathy eroded, and his temper, perhaps always formidable, became explosive and unpredictable. Pain became the unwelcome soundtrack to his reign, coloring every interaction. A king in constant agony is unlikely to be a patient or magnanimous ruler. Small annoyances could easily escalate into major confrontations when viewed through a haze of pain. His infamous impatience and terrifying rages might have been significantly amplified by this unending physical misery. Courtiers and ministers would have trod carefully, knowing that the king's mood could turn on a dime, his judgment potentially swayed not just by matters of state but by the intensity of his suffering on any given day. His personal torment likely became a public menace for those around him. The catastrophic jousting accident of January 1536, which left Henry unconscious for 2 hours, is a critical event not just for his physical decline but potentially for his mental state. Such a period of unconsciousness signifies a severe traumatic brain injury, TBI. Modern neurology tells us that TBIs, particularly to the frontal lobes, the brain's center for personality, impulse control, and judgment, can lead to profound and lasting changes in behavior. This was more than just a leg injury. It was a potentially personality-altering blow to the head. Following the 1536 accident, some observers noted a change in Henry. While attributing specific subsequent actions solely to TBI is complex, the known after-effects are telling. These can include increased impulsivity, emotional lability, wild mood swings, aggression, paranoia, and a diminished capacity for foresight and empathy. It's plausible that this severe head injury stripped away some of his previous inhibitions and emotional regulation, unleashing or exacerbating the more tyrannical aspects of his character. The jousting field may have scarred his brain as much as his leg. It wasn't just the 1536 accident. Henry, an avid sportsman in his youth, likely suffered other concussions or head impacts during hunts or earlier jousts. The cumulative effect of multiple head traumas, even seemingly minor ones, can lead to chronic neurological problems. Each blow could have contributed to a gradual erosion of his cognitive and emotional resilience, making him more susceptible to the behavioral changes seen in his later years. His aggressive pursuit of manly sports may have inadvertently damaged the very organ he needed to rule effectively and temperately. Another theory, though more debated and lacking definitive proof, is that Henry VIII suffered from syphilis. If he contracted this disease and it progressed to neurosyphilis, it could certainly account for some of the mental and behavioral changes observed, including paranoia, delusions of grandeur, memory impairment, and erratic behavior. Some historians point to the poor obstetric histories of his wives as indirect evidence, though this is far from conclusive. The great pox, if present, would have been an insidious poison attacking both his body and his mind. Neurosyphilis can manifest in various ways, often mimicking other psychiatric conditions. Symptoms can include progressive cognitive decline, impaired judgment, mood disorders, irritability, and even psychotic episodes. If Henry was indeed battling this devastating neurological stage of syphilis, it would offer another compelling, albeit grim, explanation for the increasing unpredictability and cruelty of his later action. However, without definitive medical records confirming a diagnosis, syphilis remains a tantalizing but unproven contributor to his mental decay, a historical what-if. Beyond specific injuries or diseases, the sheer frustration of his physical decline must have taken a psychological toll. The once mighty athlete became a crippled, obese, and dependent man. His inability to produce a string of healthy male heirs quickly, a cornerstone of his dynastic ambitions, was a constant source of anxiety and humiliation. This sense of diminishing personal power and control, coupled with his physical suffering, could easily have festered into a deep-seated rage and resentment, which he then projected onto those around him, his wives, his ministers, and his court. A king who feels his body betraying him, his legacy threatened, and his power ebbing away might lash out with increased ferocity to reassert control. Henry's growing tyranny, the increasingly arbitrary executions, the demands for absolute obedience, the paranoid suspicion of plots, could be interpreted in part as the desperate acts of a man trapped and tormented by his own failing physique and the psychological demons it unleashed. His kingdom became the unfortunate stage for his internal pain-fueled battles, his subjects the victims of his inner turmoil. So, was he just a bad guy, or was his body slowly poisoning his personality? The truth likely lies in a complex interplay of both. Henry undoubtedly possessed a formidable will, a streak of ruthlessness, and a profound sense of his own divine authority from the start. However, the relentless onslaught of chronic pain, the potential neurological damage from head injuries, and the systemic impact of his numerous illnesses almost certainly acted as potent amplifiers, stripping away restraint and exacerbating his worst tendencies. His body became a crucible for his character's darkest aspects. It's not that his illnesses created the tyrant, but they arguably unleashed and magnified the autocratic potential already present. A healthy Henry might have still been a demanding and formidable ruler, but the sick Henry, plagued by constant suffering and possible cognitive impairment, had fewer internal checks on his impulses. His court, already sycophantic, would have found it even harder to counsel or restrain a monarch whose pain and paranoia made him dangerously unpredictable. The diseases eroded not just his body, but perhaps his capacity for measured rule. Consider some of Henry's most notorious later decisions: the swift execution of Anne Boleyn based on flimsy evidence, the downfall of Thomas Cromwell, the brutal suppression of the Pilgrimage of Grace, the execution of Catherine Howard. While driven by political and personal motives, it's hard not to wonder if a healthier, less pain-racked mind might have acted with more caution, less vindictiveness, or greater mercy. His physical condition provides a grim backdrop to these acts of state-sanctioned violence, suggesting a ruler whose judgment was increasingly impaired by his own internal decay. In conclusion, while Henry VIII must be held accountable for the cruelty and tyranny of his reign, the profound impact of his deteriorating health on his personality and behavior cannot be ignored. His chronic pain, compounded by the likely effects of severe head injuries and other systemic diseases, offers a compelling, if unsettling, lens through which to view his transformation. The Golden Prince did not simply choose to become a monster. He was, to a significant extent, a king unmade by illness. His body's slow rot poisoning his mind and forever tainting his complex legacy with a chilling narrative of illness-driven tyranny. Beyond the well-documented ailments that tormented King Henry VIII, his festering ulcers, crippling gout, and crushing obesity, lurks a more shadowy suspect, a silent scourge whispered about in hushed tones by some historians: syphilis. While the diagnosis remains hotly debated and unproven, the possibility that Henry suffered from this devastating venereal disease adds another chilling layer to the narrative of his physical and mental disintegration. If true, this great pox would have been a relentless internal enemy, contributing significantly to his agonizing decline and tyrannical behavior. Syphilis, often called the Great Pox or the French disease, was a relatively new and terrifying affliction in 16th century Europe, having swept across the continent from the late 15th century. Its origins are debated, but its impact was undeniable. It was a disease of immense suffering, social stigma, and often a slow, hideous death. Unlike plagues that struck quickly, syphilis could linger for decades, insidiously destroying the body and mind. Its arrival cast a long, dark shadow over an era already familiar with widespread disease and early mortality, striking fear into all levels of society. Syphilis is a master of disguise, progressing through several stages, each with its own grim manifestations. The primary stage often begins with a relatively painless sore or chancre at the site of infection, which can easily be missed or dismissed. This is followed by a secondary stage, characterized by rashes, fever, swollen lymph nodes, and lesions on the skin and mucous membranes. These symptoms, too, can resolve, leading many to believe they are cured, but the spirochete, bacterium, Treponema pallidum, often remains dormant, lurking silently within the body for years, even decades. After the secondary stage, syphilis can enter a latent phase, where no symptoms are apparent. This deceptive calm can last for many years before the disease reemerges in its most destructive form, tertiary syphilis. This final stage is where the true horror unfolds, with the potential to attack virtually any organ system. It could manifest as cardiovascular syphilis, damaging the heart and major blood vessels, or as gummatous syphilis, causing destructive lesions, or most terrifyingly, as neurosyphilis, invading the brain and central nervous system, leading to madness and paralysis. Given Henry VIII's well-documented series of wives and likely numerous extramarital liaisons, his exposure to sexually transmitted diseases was certainly a possibility. As the grim jest goes, a secret admirer gave him more than just a passing fancy. If one of these encounters, perhaps in his more virile youth, led to a syphilitic infection, the disease could have silently progressed through its early stages, only to unleash its full fury in his middle and later years, coinciding with his noted physical and mental decline. The seeds of his later suffering might have been sown decades earlier. Proponents of the syphilis theory point to several aspects of Henry's medical history. His infamous leg ulcers, which refused to heal despite constant treatment, bear a resemblance to syphilitic gummas, soft tumor-like inflammatory lesions that can erode skin, bone, and organs, while his ulcers are also consistent with varicose ulcers complicated by infection and his obesity. The sheer intractability and destructive nature could suggest a deeper systemic cause, like tertiary syphilis, eating away at his flesh from within, a truly horrifying prospect for the king. Reports of Henry suffering from severe bone pain in his later years also align with symptoms of late-stage syphilis, which can cause osteitis and periostitis, inflammation of the bones and their surrounding membranes. While gout also causes intense joint pain, diffuse and deep bone aches could indicate a different pathology. Furthermore, some have speculated that his increasing weight and general malaise could have been exacerbated by the chronic systemic inflammation characteristic of untreated long-term syphilis, a body under constant, low-grade siege by the disease. A more controversial line of argument for Henry's syphilis involves the poor obstetric histories of several of his wives, including numerous miscarriages, stillbirths, and infants who died young. Syphilis in a mother can indeed lead to such tragic outcomes, or to congenital syphilis in surviving children. However, this is highly speculative. Other medical explanations, such as Rh incompatibility, genetic conditions like McLeod syndrome, linked to the Kell blood group, which some theorize Henry had, or simply the generally high rates of infant mortality in the Tudor period, could also account for these reproductive failures. If Henry did suffer from gummatous tertiary syphilis, his body would have been slowly consumed. Gummas are relentless, destructive lesions. They can erupt on the skin as large, ulcerating sores, or form internally, damaging organs like the liver or lungs. In bones, they cause erosion and intense pain. The image of the king's flesh literally rotting, his bones aching, fits disturbingly well with the potential ravages of this stage of the disease. His physicians, mystified by such resilient and destructive lesions, would have been powerless against their syphilitic origin. Cardiovascular syphilis, another horror of the tertiary stage, could also have plagued Henry. This form attacks the aorta, the body's main artery, potentially leading to aortic aneurysms, a dangerous bulging of the artery wall, or damaging the aortic valve, causing heart failure. Symptoms like shortness of breath, chest pain, and signs of heart strain, which Henry likely experienced given his obesity and dropsy, could have been compounded or even initiated by syphilitic damage to his cardiovascular system, adding another layer to his heart's immense burden. Perhaps the most terrifying manifestation, and one that aligns disturbingly with Henry's later behavior, is neurosyphilis. When the spirochetes invade the brain and spinal cord, they can wreak havoc on mental and neurological function. This could lead to a range of psychiatric symptoms, including severe personality changes, irritability, emotional lability, memory loss, impaired judgment, paranoia, delusions of grandeur, and eventually profound dementia, a condition known as general paresis of the insane. The king's mind itself could have been rotting. The increasing paranoia, explosive rages, and tyrannical unpredictability that characterized Henry's later years are all consistent with the potential effects of neurosyphilis. His decisions became more erratic, his suspicions more pronounced, and his cruelty more overt. If his brain was indeed under attack from this insidious disease, it would go a long way towards explaining the dramatic and terrifying transformation from a Renaissance prince to a feared despot. His reign of terror might have been, in part, a reign of syphilitic madness, his judgment fatally flawed. Had Henry been diagnosed with syphilis, the prescribed treatment would have been almost as horrific as the disease itself, mercury. This toxic heavy metal was administered in various forms, ingested, rubbed into the skin as an ointment, or even inhaled as vapor in fumigation chambers. The cure induced profuse salivation, loosened teeth, caused tremors, and led to severe kidney and neurological damage. Patients often died from mercury poisoning rather than syphilis. If Henry endured such treatments, it would have added yet another layer of agonizing torment to his suffering. Despite these aligning symptoms, the theory that Henry VIII had syphilis remains contentious. Many of his ailments can be explained by other more definitively established conditions. His leg ulcers are consistent with severe varicose veins, an infection in an obese, immobile man. His personality changes align with the known effects of traumatic brain injury from his jousting accidents and the psychological toll of chronic pain. The obstetric woes of his wives have plausible alternative explanations. Without direct contemporary medical confirmation, the diagnosis remains speculative. No surviving medical records from Henry's physicians explicitly diagnose him with syphilis. While this doesn't entirely rule it out, the disease carried immense stigma, and diagnoses were often veiled. The absence of such a record is significant. Furthermore, his surviving children, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth V, did not exhibit the classic, undeniable signs of congenital syphilis that might be expected if their father was actively syphilitic during their conception, though some historians debate Mary's chronic ill health. The evidence remains circumstantial, a medical mystery. Ultimately, whether Henry VIII truly suffered from syphilis may never be definitively proven, yet the possibility casts a uniquely grim shadow over his story. It provides a compelling, if horrifying, potential explanation for the confluence of his diverse physical sufferings and his disturbing mental decline. The silent scourge of syphilis, if it indeed gripped him, would have been a fittingly terrible agent in the narrative of a king who rotted alive, his body and perhaps his very sanity consumed from within by a disease emblematic of an era's suffering and a monarch's tragic, multifaceted undoing. Amidst the more visibly grotesque afflictions plaguing King Henry VIII, such as his putrid ulcers and debilitating gout, another insidious condition likely contributed to his systemic decay: type 2 diabetes. This sugar sickness, though undiagnosable and untreatable in the 16th century, aligns chillingly with Henry's lifestyle and many of his debilitating symptoms. It would have acted as a silent saboteur, relentlessly damaging his body from within, turning his own blood into a slow-acting poison and accelerating his journey towards a rotten end. This chapter explores the compelling case for Henry as a victim of this sweet yet deadly disease. Type 2 diabetes, a condition reaching epidemic proportions today, is primarily a disease of insulin resistance. Normally, the hormone insulin helps glucose, sugar from food, enter our cells to be used for energy. In type 2 diabetes, the body's cells become resistant to insulin's effects, or the pancreas cannot produce enough insulin to overcome this resistance. Consequently, glucose builds up to dangerously high levels in the bloodstream, wreaking havoc on virtually every organ system over time. While the name is modern, the underlying condition would have afflicted people long before it was understood. Imagine insulin as a key, unlocking cells to let glucose in. With insulin resistance, those locks become rusty and stiff. The pancreas, sensing high blood sugar, pumps out more and more insulin keys, trying to force entry. Eventually, the pancreas can become exhausted and insulin production may falter. This leads to chronically elevated blood glucose, which is toxic. It damages blood vessels, nerves, and organs, essentially pickling the body in sugar. This internal environment of excess glucose is where the systemic failure truly begins, a slow, sweet path to ruin. King Henry VIII's later life presented a textbook case for developing type 2 diabetes. His diet was notoriously excessive, laden with massive quantities of red meat, rich sauces, and increasingly, sugar. The Tudor period saw sugar transformed from a rare spice to a more common luxury for the wealthy, and Henry's court would have indulged heavily in sugary confections, marzipans, and sweetened wines. This, combined with his extreme obesity and profound lack of exercise due to his leg injuries and gout, created the perfect storm for insulin resistance to take hold and flourish. The sheer volume of food consumed at Henry's banquets was staggering. While meat-heavy, the Tudor penchant for elaborate desserts and the use of sugar in savory dishes meant his glucose levels were likely on a constant roller coaster, ultimately settling at a dangerously high plateau. This relentless carbohydrate and calorie assault would have overwhelmed his metabolic system. His body, designed for a more active monarch, simply couldn't cope with the sedentary king's gluttonous intake. Each feast was another nail in his metabolic coffin, pushing him further down the diabetic path. Indeed, His Majesty's sweet tooth was literally killing him, one sugary pastry at a time. While the immediate gratification of sweet foods might have offered comfort, the long-term biochemical consequences were devastating. The constant influx of sugar without adequate physical activity to burn it off would have relentlessly pushed his blood glucose higher, fueling the progression of undiagnosed diabetes. This seemingly innocent indulgence, a hallmark of royal luxury, became a potent instrument of his slow internal decay, a tragically ironic fate for a gourmand king. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence for Henry's probable diabetes lies in his chronic, non-healing leg ulcers. High blood sugar severely impairs the body's ability to heal. It damages small blood vessels, microangiopathy, reducing blood flow and oxygen to tissues, particularly in the extremities. It also impairs immune function, making infections harder to fight, and can cause nerve damage, neuropathy, reducing sensation and making injuries more likely to go unnoticed and worsen. Henry's festering treatment-resistant sores scream diabetic complication. While less explicitly detailed in historical accounts than his other symptoms, excessive thirst, polydipsia, and frequent urination, polyuria, are classic signs of uncontrolled diabetes, as the body tries to flush out excess glucose through the kidneys. If Henry experienced these, they would have added to his discomfort and further indicated a system overwhelmed by sugar. His dropsy, the severe swelling in his legs, could also be linked to diabetic kidney damage, nephropathy, as failing kidneys struggle to manage fluid balance, a vicious cycle indeed. The profound fatigue and general malaise that often accompany type 2 diabetes would also have plagued Henry. When cells are starved of glucose due to insulin resistance, the body lacks its primary fuel, leading to persistent tiredness and lethargy regardless of how much food is consumed. This would have compounded his disinclination to move, further exacerbating his obesity and insulin resistance. The once energetic king would have found himself increasingly drained, his royal vitality sapped by this unseen metabolic disorder, adding to his daily misery. In the 16th century, type 2 diabetes as a distinct clinical entity was not recognized. While ancient physicians had noted honey urine or conditions of excessive urination, sometimes termed the pissing evil, there was no understanding of blood glucose, insulin, or the underlying metabolic dysfunction. Henry's doctors would have been utterly baffled by the root cause of many of his symptoms, attributing them to humoral imbalances or other known ailments, never suspecting the sweet poison circulating in his veins. He suffered from a disease they couldn't even name. Because diabetes was undiagnosed, it was entirely untreated in any meaningful way. There was no insulin therapy, no concept of carbohydrate counting or dietary management for blood sugar control, and no medications to improve insulin sensitivity. Henry was left to the ravages of the disease unchecked. His physicians, with their bleeding, purging, and bizarre concoctions, would have been powerless against this metabolic onslaught. This lack of understanding and effective treatment allowed the diabetes to silently and systematically destroy his body from the inside out. Untreated chronically high blood sugar acts like an abrasive, damaging the lining of blood vessels throughout the body. This leads to atherosclerosis, the hardening and narrowing of arteries, restricting blood flow. In Henry's case, this would have affected his heart, increasing his risk of heart attack and contributing to heart failure. It would have crippled circulation to his legs, worsening his ulcers and leading to gangrene. His brain, too, would have been at risk from impaired blood flow, potentially contributing to cognitive issues, alongside any TBI effects. Diabetic neuropathy, nerve damage caused by high blood sugar, is another devastating complication. It can cause pain, tingling, or numbness, particularly in the feet and hands. For Henry, this could have meant he was less aware of injuries to his feet, allowing infections to take hold unnoticed. It can also affect autonomic nerves controlling bodily functions like digestion and heart rate. This insidious damage would have added to his pain, impaired his mobility, and made his body even more vulnerable to the infections that plagued him, a hidden enemy. High blood sugar creates a fertile breeding ground for bacteria and fungi, and it impairs the function of white blood cells, the body's infection fighters. This explains why people with uncontrolled diabetes are so susceptible to infections and why wounds heal poorly. Henry's constantly infected leg ulcers were a testament to this diabetic vulnerability. His body, weakened by sugar, simply couldn't mount an effective defense against the microbial invaders, allowing the rot to spread, a constant losing battle against sepsis. Ultimately, if Henry VIII did have type 2 diabetes, it would have been a key orchestrator of his widespread systemic failure. It attacked his blood vessels, nerves, immune system, and likely his kidneys and heart. It exacerbated his ulcers, compounded his immobility, and drained his energy. This sweetest of diseases, born from a lifestyle of royal excess, would have been a relentless and merciless contributor to his decline, ensuring that every organ system was under siege. It was a slow, agonizing poisoning by the very richness he so enjoyed. While a definitive posthumous diagnosis is impossible, the constellation of Henry VIII's risk factors and symptoms makes type 2 diabetes a highly probable, though tragically unrecognized companion in his final agonizing years. This silent scourge, fueled by his diet and immobility, would have systematically dismantled his health, contributing significantly to the horrifying spectacle of a king rotting alive. His sweet tooth, a symbol of his kingly indulgence, ironically played a major role in his bitter, protracted, and excruciatingly painful end, a stark lesson in metabolic self-destruction. The final years of King Henry VIII were a stark and sorrowful tableau of human decay, a brutal contrast to the vibrant, athletic monarch of his youth. Confined to his chambers, his once powerful body ravaged by a multitude of ailments, he existed as a virtual invalid, a living testament to the relentless march of physical decline. The man who had once strode purposefully through his palaces, the imposing figure who commanded armies and dissolved monasteries, was now utterly dependent on the ministrations of servants. His world shrunk to the confines of his sick room. Gone were the days of vigorous hunting, energetic dancing, and the thrill of the joust. The chronic pain from his festering leg ulcers, the relentless agony of his gout-ridden joints, and the sheer burden of his morbid obesity had rendered him almost entirely immobile. Even the simplest act of standing required immense effort and caused excruciating pain. Walking was a distant memory. The king, once a symbol of robust masculinity, was now an inert mass, his physical form a cage of suffering. His primary mode of transport became a specially constructed chair, often equipped with wheels or carried by a contingent of strong attendants. Imagine the indignity for such a proud and powerful ruler, hoisted and conveyed like inert cargo through the very palaces he once dominated. Every jolt, every uneven surface would have sent waves of pain through his ravaged body. The man who once demanded the attention of 6 wives was now reduced to demanding a bigger, more comfortable chair, a grim symbol of his diminished state and altered priorities. The stench emanating from Henry's ulcerated leg permeated his immediate surroundings, a constant, unwelcome companion. Despite the efforts of his chamber staff to cleanse the wound and mask the odor with perfumes and fragrant herbs, the underlying putrescence was inescapable. This foul miasma would have been a source of immense personal humiliation for the king and a grim reminder to all who approached him of the decay festering within. Royal audiences must have been endured with a delicate balance of deference and suppressed disgust. His increasing immobility and the unpleasant realities of his physical state led to growing isolation. While surrounded by attendants who catered to his every need, the vibrant court life he once presided over had largely receded from his personal experience. Fewer dared to be entirely candid with the increasingly irascible and unpredictable monarch, whose pain-fueled temper could erupt with terrifying force. His inner circle likely consisted more of necessary caregivers than genuine companions, a lonely existence for a man who had once thrived on attention and admiration. Sleep, a vital respite for the ailing body, would have been a rare and fragmented commodity for Henry. The constant throbbing pain from his ulcers and gout, the discomfort of his immense weight, and the likely disruptions from his breathing difficulties would have conspired to rob him of restful slumber. Nights would have been a drawn-out ordeal of discomfort, punctuated by the need for repositioning, medication, and the unwelcome awareness of his body's relentless decline. Each dawn would have brought not renewed vigor, but a continuation of his suffering. Food, once a source of pleasure and a symbol of his royal status, likely became a more complicated issue in his final years. While his appetite might have remained prodigious, his digestive system would have been under considerable strain. His immobility and potential diabetes would have further complicated his body's ability to process the rich, heavy meals he still likely demanded. Eating, instead of a joy, may have become another source of discomfort and potential complications. The rudimentary medical interventions continued, offering little more than temporary and often painful respites. His ulcers would have been regularly probed, cleansed with harsh agents, and perhaps even cauterized. He would have been subjected to various herbal remedies and likely continued to endure bloodletting and purging, all in a desperate attempt to alleviate his myriad symptoms, yet ultimately failing to stem the tide of his physical disintegration. His doctors, for all their learning, were fighting a losing battle against a body intent on self-destruction. The psychological toll of Henry's physical ruin must have been immense. A man who had once embodied power and vitality was now trapped in a grotesque and failing body. The frustration of his limitations, the indignity of his dependence, and the constant awareness of his impending mortality would have weighed heavily on his spirit. His famed temper likely flared more frequently, fueled by pain, frustration, and a profound sense of loss. The loss of his health, his mobility, and the very image he had cultivated as a strong and virile king. His relationships, already strained by his autocratic nature and tumultuous marital history, would have been further impacted by his infirmity. His final wife, Catherine Parr, played a crucial role as caregiver and companion, but the dynamics of their relationship would have been shaped by the grim realities of his health. The court, ever attuned to the shifting tides of power, would have been anxiously anticipating his demise, their loyalties and ambitions hinging on the succession, creating an atmosphere of veiled tension around the dying king. The stench of decay emanating from his leg became an increasingly potent symbol of his reign's decline. Just as his body was rotting, so too, arguably, was his authority in its final years, marked by increasing paranoia, rash decisions, and a reliance on a shrinking inner circle. The physical corruption mirrored a potential moral or political decay in the eyes of some, a grim metaphor for a kingdom held in the grip of a volatile and ailing ruler. The once magnificent royal palaces like Hampton Court and Whitehall transformed into elaborate sick rooms for the failing monarch. Their vastness offered no escape from the confines of his ailing body. Attendants moved through the grand halls with hushed reverence, aware of the suffering at the kingdom's heart. The opulence of the surroundings stood in stark contrast to the stark reality of the king's physical degradation, a poignant juxtaposition of power and mortality. As his end drew nearer, the focus of the court undoubtedly shifted towards the inevitable succession. The young Prince Edward was his heir, but Henry's weakened state created a power vacuum and fueled political maneuvering. The last days of his reign were likely marked by anxieties about the future of the Tudor Dynasty, concerns that would have added to the burdens of a dying king already struggling with immense physical discomfort. The final image of Henry VIII is a tragic one, a massive, immobile figure, racked with pain, his leg festering, his breath labored. The vibrant king of earlier portraits had vanished, replaced by a living corpse, a testament to the brutal realities of disease and the limitations of 16th-century medicine. His body, once his proudest asset, had utterly betrayed him, leaving him a prisoner in a world of suffering. The man who had reshaped England and defied the Pope was ultimately defeated by the relentless rebellion of his own flesh, a grim end for a king who once seemed invincible. So we reach the end of our grim journey into the decaying majesty of King Henry VIII. Here was a monarch of almost unparalleled power, a man who bent a nation to his will, defied the Pope, and reshaped the religious landscape of England forever. He commanded armies, built magnificent palaces, and indulged every royal whim. Yet for all his might, for all his formidable authority, Henry VIII was ultimately undone not by foreign invaders or cunning political rivals, but by a far more intimate and relentless enemy, his own disintegrating body. His final chapter was written not in glory, but in gore and putrescence. As we've explored, Henry's later years were a grotesque chronicle of physical collapse. What began with a fateful jousting accident spiraled into a cascade of debilitating ailments. His once athletic frame became a prison of morbid obesity. His leg, a site of chronic, suppurating ulcers, oozed foulness and pain. Agonizing gout attacks turned his joints into fiery tormentors. Swollen with dropsy, his limbs became leaden weight. Add to this the probable miseries of diabetes, the relentless throb of severe headaches, and the potential ravages of syphilis. It was a true symphony of bodily betrayal, each condition compounding the others. Imagine the king in his final days, a bloated, immobile hulk, often confined to his chambers, sometimes needing to be hoisted or carried by his servants. The stench of his infected ulcers would have been a constant, humiliating presence, a grim perfume of decay. His world, once stretching to the horizons of his kingdom and his ambitions, shrank to the oppressive confines of his sickbed and his chair. The man who had 6 wives and dominated a continent found himself a prisoner of his own flesh, his once commanding voice perhaps reduced to pained groans and irritable commands for comfort that rarely came. This grotesque decline serves as a stark testament. Absolute power, vast wealth, and the divine right of kings are utterly meaningless in the face of relentless, progressive disease, especially when coupled with the profound ignorance of medieval medicine. Henry could command the execution of an enemy, but he could not command his leg to heal. He could dissolve monasteries, but he could not dissolve the uric acid crystals in his joint. His crown offered no protection against the internal siege that consumed him. In the face of his body's rebellion, he was as powerless as his humblest subject. And what of the medical care he received? As we've seen, his physicians, armed with the flawed wisdom of humoral theory, likely did more harm than good. Their arsenal of leeches, bleeding, purging, and bizarre concoctions offered little solace and much additional suffering. Their interventions aimed at rebalancing non-existent humors often weakened him further, opened new avenues for infection, or poisoned him with toxic substances. Henry's wealth ensured he received the most available treatments, not necessarily the best, or even the least harmful by our standards. So, as you prepare to drift off to sleep, perhaps reflecting on this tale of royal decay, take a moment to appreciate the simple, often overlooked blessings of modern existence. Be profoundly grateful for effective painkillers that can silence agony, for antibiotics that conquer infection, for sensible dietary knowledge that can prevent metabolic catastrophe, and for basic hygiene that was a luxury then. May your own body serve you faithfully without staging the kind of gruesome, multi-front rebellion that Henry endured. His was a truly unenviable physical state. Your biggest worry might be a paper cut, a common cold, or perhaps choosing what to watch next. Compare that to a perpetually festering royal ulcer, the stench of your own decay, and the agonizing helplessness of a body breaking down, piece by excruciating piece, with no real hope of relief. Because Henry's end? Let's not mince words. That truly, disgustingly sucked. It was an undignified, painful, and malodorous conclusion to a life lived so large, a final, grim chapter in which the king was entirely consumed by his own physical ruin, rotting from the inside out. Thank you for joining us on this rather morbid exploration of King Henry VIII's unfortunate decline. We hope it's been enlightening in its own unsettling way. As you close your eyes tonight, may your dreams be blissfully free from historical odors, chronic royal pain, and the existential dread of having your leg compared to an angry volcano. Sleep well, and may your own reign over your personal health be long, peaceful, and remarkably uneventful. Until next time, fare thee well and keep your humors balanced. Or rather, don't worry about them at all.